Joe Scarborough is joining us now by phone. Joe, a question that was not asked of him is whether he would acquiesce and agree to releasing the entire report, as he had said he would a couple days ago.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Again, what the president says 1 minute doesn't actually mean much the next minute. So we'll just wait and see what happens. But it is interesting. The president said a few things in his very brief press conference that obviously, again, just it requires fact checking. Once. The first thing he said was that it was a complete exoneration, and it certainly was a complete exoneration on the issue of collusion. And that is not just good news for Donald Trump. That is good news for Americans, that the sitting president of the United States did not, in fact, collude with Vladimir Putin and Russia. So that's very good news. He said, though, it was an exhaustive investigation that also completely exonerated him on obstruction of justice, as you've been reporting, as everybody's been reporting. That actually is a question that still remains up in the air, but there wasn't enough evidence for Bob Mueller to even say that even if a president could be indicted, that this president could be indicted for obstruction of justice. And so he didn't meet that standard. And so by Justice Department guidelines, that's that. And the Justice Department shouldn't be talking about it. He did say, though, that he was a victim of all of these attacks. But many bad things happened on the other side. He, of course, was talking about the Democratic side with Hillary Clinton's campaign, and said that they had not looked at the other side. I would suggest that Hillary Clinton and members of her campaign, and I think a lot of people that covered the 2016 campaign, like yourself, would say that that's just a ridiculous statement on its face. The fact of the matter is, the FBI conducted an exhaustive investigation for over a year on Hillary Clinton, her use of emails. A lot of information was leaked throughout the course of the campaign that damaged Hillary Clinton's campaign. The Comey letter, of course, 10 days beforehand, helped elect Donald Trump president of the United States. So again, many things just not accurate on their face. But at the same time, this was a very good day for the president of the United States politically. And I would suggest also for Americans who want to be assured that somebody like Robert Mueller could exhaustively look into this matter for 2 years and find that the president did not collude with Russia. That's great news as well. I will say, though, Donald Trump could have made things much easier on himself, and the administration could have made things much easier on themselves if they hadn't lied repeatedly. This is something, everybody take a deep breath. Great news the president did not collude. But this investigation did not arise out of thin air. The president of the United States lied on the campaign trail. He said they never had any contact with Russians during the campaign. That obviously was a lie. Mike Pence said in January of 2017, nobody on the Trump campaign ever talked to Russians. That was a lie. Jeff Sessions lied in front of the Senate during testimony about contacts that he had had with Russians. That's why he had to recuse himself. Jared Kushner several times lied on his disclosure forms regarding meetings with Russians. Again, I think one of the questions that will remain for quite some time is that if there was no collusion, and we can be convinced of that today, why did Donald Trump and why did his administration and why did everybody close to him lie about contacts that they had with Russia throughout the course of the campaign? And I guess the answer to that may just be pure basic greed. He wanted to build a tower in Moscow.
That was going to be my next question. Why all the lying? Because that's been the one consistent thing in the past 2.5 years, is when you ask anybody in Trump's orbit about Russia, they will obfuscate or they will outright lie. 37 indictments in total from Robert Mueller over the course of this investigation, a number of guilty pleas secured and one conviction by trial. Paul Manafort was still lying at the end of it when he was, he was cooperating with the special counsel, but also still had a joint defense agreement with the White House. Why?
Katie, that's one of the great mysteries. There are people that got sent to jail for lying to Robert Mueller about their contacts with Russia, about their contacts with Russian oligarchs. Paul Manafort got arrested, continued to lie. Rick Gates got arrested, continued to lie during his proffer, made matters much worse for him. A man that Donald Trump told the Washington Post was one of his top foreign policy advisors lied. You had, a national security advisor. I mean, we haven't even talked about General Flynn lying about a conversation that he had with the Russian ambassador. And the list goes on. And like you said, a lot of people indicted, a lot of Russians indicted, almost 200 charges brought during the course of this investigation. And again, the mystery here is, if there was no collusion, and I think what reporters need to dig into is need to figure out, why did Donald Trump, why did Mike Pence, why did Jeff Sessions, why did the president's first national security advisor, why did the president's campaign chairman, why did the president's assistant campaign chairman, why did the president's son-in-law, why did they all lie about contacts with Russians?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.